Today, sample photos from the Nikon Z5. There is a download to the raw files in the description. Welcome to the next part of my Nikon Z5 camera review. Today, we're looking at photo samples, and there's a link in the description to raw files. So if you want to download your own raw files and play around with them, you're more than welcome to. In this video example, I have the only really high ISO shots that I have are from Haley and Brandon's wedding. And I'm not giving you the wedding shots because I feel like that's client stuff. But I will be going out tonight and getting more high ISO sample images, so you're able to play around with them a little bit. But we'll get to this. This is 10,000 ISO, and then I have one over here at 40,000 ISO. Clicking through to the first image, pretty simple. I've also included in that download the JPEG files as well. I think that it's nice to be able to see that pretty much every single image, when shot in somewhat good lighting conditions, and you're also making sure that you're getting the white balance right and the exposure is correct, that JPEG file is in most cases a finished file. And when you load it in, it actually loads to the raw file, so you kind of lose that little, I'm not sure what the camera does, but I think with de-lighting and everything, it makes for a very, very nice JPEG file that in a lot of cases are good to go. I know obviously as professionals and as photographers, we're supposed to be shooting raw, but I've spoken to this a lot of times in the past that if I'm doing a family session and everything is in controlled conditions, that means out in a park and I can put everybody in the shade and I don't have to deal with weird lighting and I'm in control of the direction and everything that we do the photos in, that I am happy to edit from the JPEGs and just add my preset on top of that. I don't feel that it degrades the image quality. It speeds up my post-production, gets my couples and families images a little bit faster. And I really do believe that most of the time what's happening for my editing process is that I'm shooting it correct in camera and I'm seeing that JPEG on the back with my Nikon D lighting turned on high, and it's like, okay, that's great. And then I load it into Lightroom and it just takes all of that away, and I basically spend time editing back to the exact spot that I was at in the back of the camera, which is just the JPEG file. So maybe something to think about in the future. If you are in control of conditions, it really will speed your post-production time up. So for dynamic range, it's obviously quite good. I don't know if I can specifically test that here. I can make this kind of like a weirdly HDR image, but you're welcome to play around with whatever you want to do with these. This is also with no preset on it, and I think that it looks like the colors and everything really do look fantastic. If you're a member over at the site, you'll have access to all of these presets. These are all of the presets that I use on, I would say, a somewhat weekly or monthly basis. The main core pack is these 2020 presets here. So they are available over on the member site, or if you don't want to join up, you can just buy them straight out. For weddings, I would say most of the time I'm over here on my 2020 main preset. We're going to look at how this works with some of the nighttime images as well as we go. And then for, I guess, more kind of landscape driven stuff, it's a combination of either summer, if I just want that real nice warmth, that obviously makes it a little too contrasty, but white balance a little too hot. But as you can see, even though there's these dumb power lines in the background and this building out here, that the core subject here, that's starting to look like a really good image. So I'm very happy with that 2020 summer preset. My film preset also, it doesn't add a whole lot of grain in previous versions. So if you're looking at the 2019 version of some of these, you'll probably notice that it does add some grain. And I personally just really enjoy having a little bit of textured images, especially as technology gets so much better, nearing perfection almost in a lot of cases, for glass and the way the sensor is interpreting that glass. It kind of is nice to add a little bit of texture to the photo and to make it not as perfect and not as almost commercial as it comes out of the camera. So maybe something to think about and season with your own artistic taste. So you have that file, you got this file too. What is this file? This is really just kind of showing the detail that this camera captures. So it'll say up here in the corner, or if you load these images into Lightroom or Photo Mechanic or whatever it might be, it'll tell you focal length, ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed. And the 35 is the 35 for Z series, so the 35mm S, which is, I would say, my favorite lens. The first lens that I bought for Z series, and really kind of the lens that I enjoy the most is just kind of out in the world coverage. And when I'm photographing a wedding, I'll usually have an 85 on one camera body and either that 35 or the Nikon Z24 on a second camera body. I enjoy both of those lenses, and the choice between 24 and 35 basically comes into what style of environment that I'm going to end up in. The 24 to 70, the kit lens, or the kit lens, the f4 that came with I guess the Z6 and Z7 kits, is probably the best kit 24 to 70 that you could ever get. I really love that lens, and then I thought that was the greatest lens in the world, and then I got the 24 to 70 f2.8, which is quite expensive, but if it's a lens that you're going to be using a lot, it's worth eventually investing into that, because it really is a phenomenal piece of glass, and it creates something that's artistic outside of what I've really seen kind of happening in other lenses. So it's really cool. Maybe look into it. Maybe don't buy it right now, but maybe in the future it might be worth looking at. So to show a little bit of the kind of dynamic range here, I guess we can go all the way down to here. So this is shot wide open, so that's why you're getting kind of the cross there. If I would have shot this image at something like f11, you would have you get that nice starburst, or it begins and it starts around, I would say, like f8, and then the more you go, also don't overdo it. If you are playing around with that and you go all the way to f22 and you're like, wow, this is an amazing starburst, it starts to really overpower the scene at that point. So maybe hang back around like f11 if you do want that little nice starburst sun effect. That was shot wide open, and it still looks pretty good. It's not the blob as I would usually expect it to be if I was shooting a lens wide open. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with this image overall. Color wise, something there might be color accurate, but when I'm in situations that are closer to sunset, I want to kind of emulate what was actually going on in the scene. And in my mind, in my memory, this is a little bit closer to kind of what it felt like, even though this might be the technical correct white balance. That's why if you do something like you hit auto, that it doesn't always do, see, auto put it basically to what I just edited to there. I would much prefer something that feels more true to the scene rather than is technically correct overall. Some nice, some detail here. This is with the 35mm lens. You can get pretty close. It's not a macro lens, but you can get really nice and close. And I'll actually use it for ring shots, and I'll just kind of crop into DX mode afterwards, or just kind of crop it in to make that ring shot work, rather than bringing a dedicated piece of macro glass with me. You can obviously do that. If you know that you're going into a place that you really do need that macro lens, it is important to have. On a wedding day, the only macro shot that I usually ever take is the ring shot, and I can get away either with a 70 to 200, as funny as it is, because on the FL version, at least the focus distance is relatively close, and if you're at 200, you can make that basically into a macro, or in other times we'll use the Tamron 35mm f1.8 because of the super close focusing distance. Again, not technically a macro lens, but really fantastic. Some images here of Clarissa. That is kind of exactly as we shot it straight out of camera. It's a little more kind of orangey than I would want, because we were using the sun as a main light, and the sun was doing very interesting things that I haven't seen before this day, so it worked out really well. To run through kind of what presets I guess I would probably be using, I would probably be doing something like my clean preset when the lighting is just really great, and then I would be playing around with white balance to fit whatever I kind of wanted it to be. So something like that I would be pretty happy with overall. And then I use either a program called Portraiture or Luminar for just skin enhancement, rather than actually going in and manually doing a retouch. Another problem with how good all of these cameras are getting, this is a shot from the 35mm lens. Technically, again, really close to perfection, and it becomes a little bit more difficult to actually retouch. So on this 85 shot, just kind of the natural softness of the lens comes through a little bit more. When you get into the actual Z series glass, you're starting to get a lot more optically perfect, or clinically correct, I guess. So you might need to rely a little bit more on either plugins to process and to help out skin a little bit, or if you want to go in and properly do it, that's totally cool too. I've found that most of the time that I can get 95% of the way to what I would have done manually through a plugin now. So I'm pretty happy to let the plugin do the work. Moving into Blue Hour, Cash Money. This image, again, like the JPEG, I was super happy with it. If I was going to be editing this for myself, I'd probably do something like this to kind of enhance the purpley blue of Blue Hour. And maybe we'd be doing something like that. And if you're ever, so for instance, with buildings and with architecture like this, if I'm ever unsure, I actually just come down here and I just hit the auto button. And usually that'll get me closer. See? Now that's a more technically correct image as it should be, and I'll crop in this side a little bit to make it nice and symmetrical. And there we go. You could probably even add a little graduated filter over here to either darken up this side or to brighten up the other side. Cool. Something like that I am pretty happy with overall. Maybe vibrance up a little bit. So this shot here, 800 ISO. I would say typically wedding day, if I am somewhere that basically I need to be able to see, physically be able to see people, so things never really get that dark at a wedding. I would say 800 ISO, maybe once I'm inside, if it's still a little bit ambient bright outside. I'm usually relying on window light as long as I possibly can before switching to any sort of strobe. I would say 800 ISO, pretty regular on a wedding day. 1600, 3200, also pretty regular. And as you can see here, that like 800 ISO looks like 100 ISO quite easily. So next image. This is one that is a little underexposed in these foreground areas. So even if moving it up +2 over here, it doesn't really add any sort of negative thing. I'm starting to see a little bit more kind of grain and noise in here, but that's kind of pushed 2 stops from an 800 ISO image. So I'm quite happy with that overall. And now into a shot of our lovely studio, 1000 ISO. Again, if I push that a little bit, say I screwed up the exposure, I wanted to bring it to something like that. Another +2 stops. And again, very nice and detailed in here. Very happy with how that performs, and if I was to shoot it correctly in camera, as you can see, even better. And now moving into a scene with a lot of dynamic range, as you're seeing the light there. If you drag the highlights all the way down, it starts to kind of gray out like this, that's how you know you're doing it wrong. You want it somewhere probably around there for the sign, but I also want to brighten up the background a bit. That's not the way to do it. Probably overall exposure. Make the sky kind of where you want it to be, and then bring the highlights down to kind of match that. I would say that did a pretty good job overall. Adding something like this main preset is going to make that sky even more kind of blue and matte. Again, seasoned to taste. If that's not the look that you like, then don't edit to it. Don't take me as the person that tells you how to create your own art. But I'm just kind of showing you at least some of the possibilities here, and to take it from an image that begins as something like that, I'm going to say version edit is a lot better. A few other images that you guys can look at. This is a very, very low ISO image. One of the theories, I guess, so the Z5 does not have a backlit sensor in it. It just has a regular sensor. It's a new sensor that I guess hasn't been in any cameras yet, but theoretically, by not having that sensor, it should mean that low ISO, so if you're shooting at something, whatever I guess the base ISO is, I'm guessing that 50 is probably under it. If you're at that lowest ISO, it technically will perform better than a backlit sensor, theoretically, but I'll let somebody that actually knows more of the science behind that actually test that. Gerald Undone, I'm sure, will be all over that. As you can see, lots of really, really great detail in this shot. Very, very happy with it. No contrast points here blown apart. I guess I've removed that, but even without it, no issues whatsoever. Very happy. Some more outdoor photos. I noticed in the video that I did of this, I saw a little bit of these lines kind of moving a little bit, so I'm going to investigate further. I didn't notice that until this morning, actually, so I'm going to look into that and see if that's a real thing, or if that was just maybe the way that my Kodak or my video card decided that it wanted to display it. But the image overall, everything very nice, and crisp. That was shot at f4.0. Moving into the reception, the dinner. As you can see, again, not a macro lens, the 35, but it can get pretty close and it can do all the detail shots that you would need. Holding everything together really well here, the combination. I do 100% again recommend the 35mm lens. Either the 35 or the 50 should probably be the first prime that you get. 85 also absolutely amazing for portraiture, but I would say it's, at least in my experience, to have a more general lens, to have a 50 if I know I'm going to be doing some couple shoots is great, but also 50 is a little bit more versatile than just going for an 85, because 85 is very much a single purpose lens. Nice flowers. I'm singing you a song about flowers now. I feel like the highlights start to break apart a little bit faster than most other camera files that I edit with. I don't know if that can be quantified by any sort of science, but my feeling is, and I kind of felt that back here in this beautiful Tim Horton shot as well, that it seemed like I had, even though I have the flexibility and the dynamic range, that when I'm pulling the exposure up, it feels like it's, I don't know, that it's getting a little bit too hot too quickly, and I'm losing kind of all the detail over here. Again, maybe that's just my crazy mind playing tricks on me, but it's something that I'm getting the feeling of. I would say I'm the most used to editing files from a D850, and those files really do tend to stay together really, really well. So maybe that's something to take into consideration, but I haven't noticed any problems with it. It's just something that I've kind of observed in my mind. Again, kind of feeling it on that highlight here. Delighting, if you only have the JPEG, that delighting is likely going to have the dress looking something like that, but not making it look like you've obviously altered the image. So I'm pretty happy overall with that. And then my presets are the opposite of whatever a desaturated green preset would be. That it adds niceness to the greens. That's the technical term. I want greens. I want the green environment to exist, and something like this, maybe even too green, too acidic overall. And I might have to roll back the white balance on something like that to make that work. But as you can see, lots of depth all over here. Even if I wanted to bring up this area here, I could probably just do that, no problem, and it would just come back. Yeah, so you have all of this shadow detail in here, and if you wanted to start layering even images from the same raw file, like you have a lot of detail still in here. It's also out of focus because it's just physically out of focus because of where it was. I'm just trying to show you, it's not that bad. And then if I was to go down here and actually, here, I'll do one more quick example. So yeah, all of this was pretty clearly black, and it brightens up quite well. Again, this is at ISO 500, so not even base ISO, and at 5 stops, it's still, if the entire scene would have been exposed to what that was exposed at, which is kind of like that dark level, that scene would have come back totally fine, which is really nice. This is just a sample image of how I enjoy the way that it kind of rolls off into the in-focus areas. So it starts off obviously out of focus here. It's usually bad practice, I would say, to frame something really close to the foreground that's out of focus. It just will always feel weird. But as far as weird feelings go, I would say this is a pretty minimal weird feeling. That some lenses really make that foreground blur like really, really crazy and strange. I think this works really well. Background blur is nice and pleasing. Everything came together quite nicely. Again, lots of depth in all the colors here. I will be finding high ISO shots to send to you as well. We will get into some of the darker environments right now. So now we're looking at a 1000 ISO image that is correctly-ish exposed for the sky. It might even be a little too bright, but definitely incorrectly exposed for down here. So I'm going to see, I'm not going to do that. So something like this. Actually, we'll go in here. So you can see that the brightness here isn't actually a lens defect. I initially thought that it was these were getting a little bit bright just because of the contrast points, but it's actually the smoke from these lanterns. Going in here, after going up, I would say the limit, at least my limit, would probably be somewhere around there as far as just kind of noise and becoming uncomfortable with the amount of noise in it. Obviously, image overexposed, that would be my noise level, my noise floor, I guess, that I would be cool with. But overall, I would say that this did a really fantastic job. This is one of those times that you can't really shoot everything exactly as you want it in camera, that you do have to kind of go in and you have to pull some highlights down in order to kind of make the scene as you saw it. Our brains and eyes have much better dynamic range. And then usually when I edit a scene kind of that heavily, I'll also go in here quickly and actually, I guess that was fine. I'll kind of do this little front vignette so it just doesn't feel like the entire scene has been completely altered, and I want it to kind of blend together a little bit better. And I just do that quickly with a graduated filter. But 1000 ISO, moved up +2, and still very, very happy with that image. Here we go into 10,000 ISO, which I would say is probably the upper range of things. Like above this, people wouldn't be able to see each other. If I would have had to go to 20,000 ISO or 40,000 ISO, which I have an example of. And I would say quite happy with this, even moved up a little bit. I think that that is still totally great exposure. So if you're nervous about the high ISO performance of this sensor because it's not tested, it's not backlit, I think that it's totally fine. As just be aware that you have to get it at least pretty close in camera, otherwise it's going to maybe give you some difficulties in post-production. So something like this, if I was looking for more detail kind of up here and I had to move that up 2 stops, it's starting to get a little grainy. But that said, the grain that it actually adds, I don't see it as a negative as much as older color-based grain would be. That this is kind of very monochromatic and it feels okay to me. So if you do have to deliver images like this, I think that's totally fine. You can also come in here and you can actually probably just remove a bunch of noise too if you really wanted to. So that's with noise reduction on, and as you can see, a lot of it just disappears. And overall, pretty happy with that image. Moving into the final image right here, 40,000 ISO. Challenging environment. Again, that nice, not too distracting of grain. And if you add some noise reduction, it makes it pretty usable pretty quickly. So something like that, if you absolutely have to use this, you can get away with using 40,000 ISO with just a little bit of noise reduction. So don't be afraid to push the ISO. I wouldn't ever suggest shooting at 40,000 ISO. This was definitely just kind of a test to see what that would look like. But overall, I would not be afraid of pushing the ISO in a normal environment. This is probably the most difficult situation you could find yourself in. I'll be doing a full wedding day video with this wedding that goes a little bit more into detail to my process of how I correctly would have shot this wedding. These sample images are from a way that's obviously pushing the camera beyond its limits. But if I was to say position myself over here in the lights, and there's still lights over here that I could have had in the background as out of focus, and I could have been using this as a main light to light the people that I was taking images of, or I could have got into flash, or I could have got into a spotlight. Another kind of workaround for tight situations similar to this is that if you're working with a video person, so I was working with Tim, it's an easy request to ask if we can just set up a small video light, and it doesn't even need to be a high intensity, just a soft little like square panel like this with a little diffusion gel on it, and that will give us more than enough light to be able to shoot realistically at maybe that 6,000, 8,000 ISO range that we're totally comfortable in. So there are ways around it. Don't stress about this camera not being good in high ISO because I'm quite happy with it. So thanks so much for watching. And again, playlist in the description below if you want to check out more sections of this review on the Nikon Z5.